In the village of Hollowmere, there lived a woman who kept 41 hives behind her cottage, though only 40 had ever been opened. The 41st stood alone at the edge of the lavender field, untouched for so many years that even the oldest villagers could not remember seeing its lid lifted. Yet every evening, without fail, Beatrice Thorne walked to it and stood there until darkness fell. She had lived in that cottage at the edge of Hollowmere for longer than most of the villagers had been alive, tending her bees with the quiet devotion of someone who has found, in small and steady rituals, a way to carry something too large for words. Each morning she rose before the sun had fully cleared the hedgerows, wrapped herself in a shawl the color of oatmeal, and walked the row of hives in the same order she always walked them, lifting each lid, breathing in the warm gold scent of wax and clover, setting each one back down exactly as she had found it. And every day, when the light began to soften and the shadows of the apple trees stretched long across the grass, she would walk to that one hive at the far end of the row and simply stand there. She never opened it. Not in spring, when the first hives were checked for their queens. Not in summer, when the honey ran thick and golden and the whole village seemed to smell of it. Not even in autumn, when every other hive was harvested before the cold came to settle over Hollowmere like a heavy gray blanket. She would stand before it at dusk, her hands folded in front of her apron, until the light had gone entirely, until the bees had quieted for the night and the first stars had begun to prick through the sky. Then she would turn, walk back to her cottage and light the fire, and the smoke from her chimney would curl up into the darkening evening the same way it always had, faithful and familiar, a small gray ribbon rising over the rooftops of a village that had long since stopped wondering out loud why one hive, of all the hives in Hollowmere, was never touched. The neighbors had their guesses, of course, murmured over garden fences and shared quietly after church, though none of them ever asked Beatrice directly, and she never offered an answer. Some said it was simply an old hive she had lost the knack for working. Others said there was nothing inside it at all, that it stood empty and had for years, kept only out of habit. But those who had lived in Hollowmere the longest, who remembered Beatrice as a younger woman walking that same row of hives with her husband Samuel beside her and a small girl trailing behind them both, knew better than to believe it was empty. They knew there are some things a person keeps not because they are useful, but because letting them go would mean letting go of something else entirely, something far harder to name. And so the hive remained, pale and quiet at the end of the row, waiting the way old wood waits, patient and still, for whatever it was that Beatrice Thorne visited it each evening to remember. The baker's name was Elias Hobbs, a broad, soft-spoken man who had inherited his shop from his father and his father before him, and who had known Beatrice since he was a boy running errands for his mother. Each morning, before the village had properly woken, he would set aside the heel of the first loaf, still warm, wrapped in a cloth, and Beatrice would collect it on her way back from the hives, the same as she had for 30 years. Neither of them spoke much during these exchanges. There was no need. It was simply understood between them, the way understanding grows between people who have shared the same quiet corner of the world for the whole of their lives, that some kindnesses are best offered without ceremony, passed hand to hand like the bread itself, still holding its warmth. On Sundays, the vicar would come to call, an elderly man named Reverend Aldridge who had baptized half the village and buried the other half, and who took his tea the same way every time, with a little too much honey and a little too much cream, seated in the chair nearest the window where he could watch the hives from a comfortable distance. He and Beatrice rarely spoke of anything beyond the weather, the state of the roads, the health of this or that elderly parishioner. Yet there was a comfort in his visits that went beyond the words exchanged, the comfort of a friendship worn smooth by decades of familiarity, needing nothing more than presence to sustain it. It was Reverend Aldridge, in fact, who had first suggested that Beatrice take on some help with the hives, for her hands, though still steady, had grown slower with the passing years, and the row had grown long enough that a single pair of hands could no longer manage it with the same ease as before. And so it was that a young man named Tom Ferris had come to her, gangly and eager and not quite 20, the son of a farming family on the far side of the village, hoping to learn the craft of beekeeping the way his grandfather once had before the knowledge had slipped quietly out of his family's hands. Beatrice had taken him on with little fuss, teaching him patiently, hive by hive, the way to read the bees' moods from the pitch of their hum, the way to move slowly and without fear, the way to know when a frame was heavy enough with honey to harvest and when it needed to be left a while longer to build. She had taught him everything about every hive along that row, save one. On his very first day, before he had so much as touched a single frame, she had walked him past the pale, weathered hive at the end of the row and told him simply, in a voice that left no room for questions, that this one was not to be opened, not now, not ever, not for any reason he might think to invent. Tom, who was young enough to still be curious about most things but old enough to recognize the particular stillness in an older woman's voice when she meant something fully, had simply nodded and had never asked again, though he found his eyes drifting toward that hive more often than he might have admitted, wondering, the way the rest of the village wondered, what lay inside it, and why it alone among all the hives seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken. The days settled into their gentle rhythm around these small relationships, the bread from Elias, the tea with Reverend Aldridge, the quiet lessons with Tom, each one a thread in the soft fabric of Beatrice's life in Hollowmere. In the evenings, when the work was done, she would sit by her hearth with a shawl drawn over her shoulders, the fire crackling low, the scent of beeswax candles mingling with the last traces of wood smoke drifting from the chimney, and she would listen to the rain, when it came, tapping gently against the small-paned windows of her cottage, and to the quiet rustle of the wind through the apple trees outside. It was a life built of small comforts, tea steeped a little too long, bread still warm at the center, the low murmur of bees settling for the night, and if there was a sorrow folded somewhere beneath it all, it moved as quietly through her days as the smoke moved through the evening air, present, but never disturbing the peace that had settled, layer upon layer, over Hollowmere and the woman who tended its finest hives. If you find comfort in stories like this one, gathered slowly around quiet English villages and the small, tender mysteries people carry with them, you are welcome to stay a while longer here at the Murmured Garden, where there is always a fire lit and a story waiting to be told. Beatrice Thorne had not always tended that row of hives alone, and there had been a time, not so long ago that the memory of it had faded, when the apiary behind the cottage had rung with more than the hum of bees. She had been a young woman when she married Samuel Thorne, a beekeeper's son from a neighboring parish who had come to Hollowmere with little more than a few borrowed hives and a gift for coaxing life from even the most stubborn of colonies. Together they had built the row hive by hive, season by season, until it stretched the full length of the garden wall. A small golden empire built from patience and early mornings and the particular kind of love that expresses itself not in grand gestures but in the steady, daily work of building something meant to last. Samuel had been a quiet man, much like Beatrice herself, and theirs had been a marriage built less on words than on the comfortable rhythm of shared labor. The two of them moving down the row together at dawn, passing the smoker between them without needing to ask, each knowing without being told which hive needed attention and which could be left to its own quiet business. In the evenings they would sit together on the bench outside the kitchen door, watching the last bees return heavy-legged with pollen to their hives, and Samuel would tell her, in his unhurried way, that there was no finer way to spend a life than watching something small and patient grow into something whole. It was into this life that their daughter Ivy had been born, a bright, curious child who took to the hives the way some children take to water, without fear, without hesitation, as though the bees themselves recognized something kindred in her and had decided, collectively, to welcome her among them. By the time she was 7, Samuel had given her a hive of her very own, the smallest in the row, and had taught her, patiently and with great seriousness, as though she were being entrusted with a secret of considerable importance, how to move slowly among the frames, how to listen for the particular note in the hum that meant contentment, and how to thank the bees always for the sweetness they were willing to share. Ivy grew up among the hives the way other children grow up among books or gardens or the sea, shaped quietly by her surroundings until beekeeping was not something she did but something she simply was, woven into the fabric of who she understood herself to be. She had her mother's steady hands and her father's patience, and by the time she was a young woman of 19, she could read a hive's health at a glance the way some people read faces, could tell, from nothing more than the pitch of the hum and the pattern of the bee's movement at the entrance, whether a colony was thriving or troubled, whether it needed more room or less disturbance, whether the queen inside was strong or failing. There were smaller stories woven through those years too, the kind that make up the true texture of a life, quieter than the central threads but no less important for their quietness. There was the summer Ivy had nursed an injured swallow back to health in a basket by the kitchen fire, feeding it with a dropper until it could fly again, and had cried for a full day after releasing it, not from sorrow but from the particular ache of loving something enough to let it go. There was the winter the well had frozen solid and Samuel had walked 3 miles each morning to fetch water from the mill pond rather than let his family go without, returning each time with his beard crusted white with frost and a smile that suggested he had rather enjoyed the small adventure of it. There was the autumn evening when Reverend Aldridge, then a younger man himself, had come to bless the hives before the first frost, a tradition Samuel's own father had begun and that the family had kept faithfully every year since, walking the row together with a small vessel of blessed water, murmuring words of protection over each hive in turn. Ivy had grown into a young woman known throughout Hollowmere and the villages beyond for her gentle way with the bees and her generous spirit besides, the sort of person neighbors spoke of with quiet fondness, the kind who remembered which of the elderly widows preferred her honey thinner for their tea and which of the farming families struggled most in a hard winter and left a jar or two extra on their doorsteps without ever being asked. She had a particular fondness, too, for a wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother, small and carved with a pattern of bees and clover along its lid, in which she kept small treasures of no great value but considerable sentiment, a pressed flower from her first hive harvest, a ribbon from a village fair, a letter or two from a friend who had moved away to the coast. The box sat on the mantel of the cottage still, though it had not been opened in longer than anyone but Beatrice could say, its small brass clasp gone slightly dull with years of undisturbed rest. It was in her 23rd year that Ivy's dearest friend from girlhood, a young woman named Clara who had moved with her family to a town some 3 days' journey to the north, fell gravely ill, and word reached Hollowmere by letter that Clara's mother, overwhelmed with the care of several younger children besides, could not manage the nursing alone. Ivy, who had never in her life turned from someone in need, packed a small case within the day and told her parents she would go north to help see Clara through the worst of the fever, promising, with the easy confidence of the young, that she would be home again well before the frost came to harden the ground and put the hives to their winter sleep. Beatrice remembered, even now, the particular color of the sky the morning Ivy left, a soft, unremarkable gray that gave no hint of anything to come, and the way Ivy had paused at the garden wall before climbing into the cart that would carry her to the coaching road, turning back to look at the row of hives one last time, as though some part of her already sensed she ought to fix the sight of them carefully in her memory. She had waved and smiled and called out that she would write as soon as she arrived, and the cart had rolled away down the lane and out of sight, and Beatrice had stood at the wall a long while after, watching the dust settle back over the empty road, feeling, without quite knowing why, a small and unfamiliar coldness settle somewhere beneath her ribs. The letters had come at first as promised, cheerful and full of small details, Clara's fever breaking and then returning, the younger children underfoot and demanding, the northern town smaller and grayer than Hollowmere but not without its own particular charm. Ivy wrote of missing the hives, of hoping the frost would hold off a little longer so she might be home in time to help with the last harvest, of a dream she'd had one night in which she was standing among her own bees again, the hum of them wrapping around her like something warm. Samuel had read each letter aloud by the fire, and Beatrice had kept every one of them, tied with a ribbon and placed, eventually, into that same carved wooden box on the mantel, alongside Ivy's other small treasures, a growing collection of her daughter's voice carried home to her one folded page at a time. And then, as autumn deepened and the first frost came earlier than expected that year, silvering the grass and stilling the last of the bees into their winter cluster, the letters stopped. Beatrice remembered the waiting most of all, the particular quality of it. How the days seemed to stretch longer and thinner as October wore into November. How she found herself listening for the sound of the post before it had properly had time to arrive. How she told herself, again and again, that Ivy had simply grown careless with her letters the way the young sometimes do when their days fill up with other cares, that there was nothing beneath the silence but a daughter's forgetfulness, easily forgiven. Samuel had said little during those weeks, though she noticed he took to walking the lane each evening at dusk, further than his usual rounds required, as though he might meet the postcart coming the other way and hurry news along by the sheer force of wanting it. The letter that finally came was not in Ivy's hand. It was written instead by Clara's mother, in a careful, grief-worn script that Beatrice would recognize for the rest of her life, and it told them, as gently as such news can ever be told, that the fever that had first taken hold of Clara had turned, in its final weeks, and settled instead into Ivy, who had nursed her friend so faithfully and so long that she had given no thought to her own weariness until it was far too late to matter. Ivy had been cared for in her last days with every kindness the family could offer, had been kept warm and comfortable and never once left alone, and had spoken often, in her final clearer hours, of home, of the hives, of a hope that the frost had not yet come and that there might still be time to see the last of the season's honey brought in. She had asked, near the very end, that her family not grieve too heavily, for she had lived, she said, a life full of sweetness, and counted herself fortunate for every hour of it. There had been no time to send word before, Clara's mother wrote, no way to reach them quickly enough across the distance, and she had done what she could, had sat with Ivy through the worst of the fever and had held her hand at the last, and she hoped, with what humility such a letter could carry, that this might offer some small comfort amid an unbearable loss. Samuel had read the letter through once, in a voice that did not waver until the very final line, and had then set it down upon the table and walked out into the garden without a word, and Beatrice had followed him as far as the door and no further, understanding, in the particular way that long marriages understand such things, that some griefs must be walked alone before they can be shared. She had watched him move down the row of hives in the fading light, pausing longest at the smallest one, the one that had been Ivy's own since she was 7 years old, and she had seen him rest his hand flat against its lid the way a person rests a hand against the shoulder of someone sleeping, gently so as not to wake them. The frost came in earnest that week, hardening the ground and stilling the last stragglers among the bees, and Samuel tended every hive in the row as the season required, harvesting what remained, wrapping each colony against the cold to come, save for the one hive that had been Ivy's, which he left entirely untouched, its bees clustering inward against the winter with no one to check on them, no one to disturb whatever quiet work they were doing in the dark. He never spoke of why, and Beatrice never asked, understanding that some decisions are made not in the mind but somewhere lower and older, in the part of a person that simply cannot bear to lift a lid that a beloved hand had last closed. Samuel lived 12 years beyond that autumn, and in all that time he tended the row of hives faithfully, every one of them but that single hive at the end, which he visited each evening at dusk exactly as his wife would come to do after him, standing before it in silence, his hand resting sometimes on its weathered lid, before turning back toward the cottage and the fire and the life that continued, quietly, around the small, enduring shape of what had been lost. When he passed, on a mild evening in early spring with the first hives just beginning to stir from their winter cluster, Beatrice had taken up the visits herself without needing to discuss it, as though the two of them had simply passed the task between them the way they had passed the smoker down the row each morning for so many years, without words, without ceremony, understanding entirely what needed to be done and doing it. And so the years had settled into the shape the village now knew, Beatrice tending 40 hives and standing faithfully each evening before the 41st, the wood grown pale and silvered, the bees within left to their own quiet devices, undisturbed by harvest or inspection, kept alive by nothing more than whatever will bees carry to endure on their own when a hand no longer reaches in to guide them. It was not, Beatrice had come to understand over the long years of standing there at dusk, a hive she visited out of grief alone anymore, though grief had certainly built the habit in the beginning. It had become, instead, something closer to companionship, a way of remaining near to a daughter who had loved that small wooden box more than any other, of keeping one corner of the garden exactly as it had been when Ivy last stood beside it, waving from the cart, promising she would be home before the frost. Autumn had come again to Hollowmere, the same as it had come some 30 years before, silvering the grass with early frost and turning the leaves of the apple trees to soft shades of amber and rust. When a stranger arrived in the village on the afternoon coach, a woman of perhaps 35 years with dark hair pinned loosely beneath a traveling bonnet and a manner about her that suggested she had come a long way and was not entirely certain of her welcome at the end of it. She asked at the inn, first, where she might find a woman named Beatrice Thorne, and the innkeeper's wife, who knew everyone in 3 villages by name and reputation both, had looked at her with the particular curiosity reserved for strangers who ask after the quiet corners of a place rather than its inns or its views, and had given her simple directions down the lane past the church, to the cottage with the long row of hives behind it. Beatrice was in the garden when the stranger came, kneeling among the last of the season's herbs, gathering what remained of the lavender before the frost took it entirely, and she straightened slowly at the sound of the garden gate. Her hand pressed briefly to the small of her back in the manner of someone whose body had grown accustomed to reminding her of its years. The woman at the gate hesitated, as though uncertain now that she had arrived whether to proceed at all, and it was this hesitation, more than anything spoken, that caught Beatrice's attention, for she recognized in it something of her own old habit of standing a long while before a door she was not entirely sure she wished to open. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Hale and explained, in the careful manner of someone who has rehearsed her words many times over a long journey, that she had come from a town some 3 days to the north, that her mother had passed the previous spring, and that in going through her mother's belongings she had discovered, tucked into the back of an old writing desk, a small bundle of letters and a single note in her mother's hand that had never been sent, addressed to a Mrs. Beatrice Thorne of Hollowmere. She had brought it with her, she said, because something in her mother's note had troubled her deeply enough that she felt she could not simply let it remain unread and unanswered in a drawer, not when the person it concerned might still be found. Beatrice felt something shift beneath her ribs at the name of the northern town, a coldness not unlike the one she had felt watching Ivy's cart disappear down the lane so many years before. Though she said nothing of this, only invited the stranger inside, out of the gathering chill, and set the kettle to boil with hands that were, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not entirely steady. They sat together at the small table by the window, the one where Reverend Aldridge always took his tea on Sundays, and Margaret drew from her traveling case a small bundle of letters, worn soft with handling, and a single folded note, and set them upon the table between herself and Beatrice with the particular gentleness of someone handling something they understood to be fragile beyond its physical form. "My mother's name was Clara," she said, and something in Beatrice's chest tightened at the name. A name she had not heard spoken aloud in 3 decades. A name that had lived, until this moment, only in the careful, grief-worn script of a letter kept folded in a wooden box on the mantel. Margaret explained, gently, that her mother had spoken of Hollowmere only rarely throughout her childhood, and always with a particular tenderness mixed with something that seemed almost like sorrow, mentioning a friend from her girlhood who had nursed her through a terrible fever at great cost to herself, a young woman with gentle hands and an easy laugh who had loved bees the way some people loved music, entirely and without reservation. Her mother had told her, more than once, that she owed a debt to that friend's family that she had never properly found the words or the courage to repay, though she had written to them, she said, in the difficult weeks after, and had always wondered whether her words had been enough, whether they had understood how deeply she grieved alongside them, whether there was more comfort she might have offered had she known how. The note that had never been sent, Margaret said, unfolding it now with careful fingers, had been written some years after the first letter, in a hand grown older and steadier, as though her mother had found, with time, words she had not been able to summon in the rawness of the earlier grief. She offered to read it aloud, and Beatrice, who found she could not yet trust her own voice to ask, only nodded. The note spoke in careful, halting sentences of a young woman's final days, tended with more love than duty could ever demand, who had spoken often of home and of hives and of a hope that the frost might hold off a little longer, and who had asked, in her clearer hours, that no one grieve too heavily on her account, for she had counted her life a sweet one and was grateful for every hour of it. It spoke, too, of a debt Clara had carried for the whole of her life afterward, a sense that kindness of that size deserved to be answered in kind, and a regret, never quite resolved, that circumstance and distance had kept her from ever traveling to Hollowmere herself to say so in person, to see the row of hives her friend had so loved, to thank the family who had raised a daughter capable of such devotion. Margaret looked up from the note, her eyes bright with something between grief and hope, and asked, in a voice gone soft with uncertainty, whether Beatrice might be the mother spoken of in her own mother's letters, whether this might, after all this distance and all these years, be the right cottage, the right row of hives, the right quiet corner of England where an old debt of kindness might finally find its way home. Beatrice did not answer at once. She rose instead from the table, crossed to the window, and looked out at the long row of hives stretching toward the garden wall, 40 of them settling for the evening, and the 41st standing pale and apart at the very end, and she found that her hands, when she pressed them together, were trembling in a way they had not trembled in longer than she could recall. "Yes?" Beatrice said at last, turning back from the window, her voice quieter than she intended, worn thin by the weight of 3 decades finally meeting itself in the small warm kitchen. "I am the mother your letters speak of. Ivy was my daughter." Margaret's hand rose to her mouth, and for a long moment neither woman spoke, the kettle beginning its low whistle on the hearth entirely unattended, the last gray light of the afternoon settling softly through the window glass. It was Margaret who moved first, rising to see to the kettle herself, giving Beatrice a moment of privacy in which to gather what had come suddenly, unexpectedly undone, and when she returned to the table with 2 cups of tea, she set one before Beatrice with the same careful gentleness she had shown the letters, as though she understood, without being told, that some moments require a person to simply wait, quietly, until the other is ready. "I have wondered about you for years," Margaret said eventually, wrapping both hands around her cup the way a person does when the warmth of it offers more comfort than the tea itself. "My mother spoke of Ivy often, though never quite by name in front of us as children, only as her dear friend from Hollowmere, the beekeeper's daughter. It was only after she passed, going through her letters, that the whole of it became clear to me, how much your daughter had given, how much my mother had carried afterward, wanting to make it right and never quite finding the way." Beatrice found, to her own quiet surprise, that she wanted to know more, that the old careful silence she had kept around Ivy's memory for 30 years had shifted, somehow, in the presence of the stranger who had traveled 3 days to bring an unspoken debt home to rest. She asked, gently, what Ivy had been like in those final weeks, whether she had suffered greatly, whether she had been afraid, and Margaret, though she had not been born yet to witness it herself, answered from the well of stories her mother had told and retold across a childhood, weaving together a picture built from second-hand memory and inherited grief. "My mother said she never once complained," Margaret said. "Not even when the fever was at its worst. She said your daughter used to hum while she worked, the same little tune over and over, and it was only years later, when my mother kept bees herself for a short while in our own garden, that she realized it was the sound beekeepers make to calm a hive, that Ivy had been calming herself the way she calmed her bees, humming through her own fear so that no one else in the house would have to carry it alongside their own." Beatrice pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth at this, for it was such a small detail, and such an entirely true one, that it seemed to bring her daughter into the room more vividly than any grander memory could have done. She remembered, suddenly and completely, the particular tune Ivy used to hum among the hives as a girl, a wandering, wordless melody she had made up herself at 7 years old and never abandoned. And to hear that she had carried it with her all the way to a stranger's sick room, hundreds of miles from home, humming it still in her final days, undid something in Beatrice that 30 years of careful, quiet grief had never quite managed to reach. They spoke for a long while as the afternoon light faded fully into evening, Margaret sharing what fragments she had gathered over a lifetime of half-heard family stories, Beatrice offering, in turn, small pieces of Ivy's childhood that seemed to matter suddenly, urgently, to preserve and pass on. The swallow nursed back to health one long-ago summer, the hive given to her at 7, the wooden box with its bees and clover carved along the lid. It was, Beatrice found, the first time in 3 decades she had spoken of Ivy at length to anyone, even Samuel in his final years having grown as quiet on the subject as she herself had, both of them carrying their grief in parallel silence rather than sharing the weight of it between them, and she was surprised to find how much lighter the sharing made it feel, as though grief, kept too long unspoken, grows heavier simply from the effort of its own keeping. As the evening deepened, Tom arrived at the cottage gate for his usual final check of the hives before dark, and paused there a moment, sensing something different in the quality of the light spilling from the kitchen window, some warmth in it that had not been there before. He knocked softly and let himself in when Beatrice called for him to enter, and stood a little awkwardly in the doorway, uncertain whether he had interrupted something private, until Beatrice introduced him simply as the young man who helped her with the hives, and invited him to sit a while if he wished. It was Tom, in his quiet way, who asked the question that neither woman had yet given voice to directly, though it had hovered between them the whole evening. "Is this about the last hive, then?" he asked, looking between the two women with the careful uncertainty of someone who suspects he may finally be near an answer he has wondered about since his very first day of work in that garden. "The one at the end of the row?" Beatrice looked toward the window, toward the darkening garden beyond it where the row of hives stood settling for the night, the 41st pale and silent at the far end, and she found, for the first time in 30 years, that the question did not close something within her but opened it instead, gently, the way a door left ajar allows warmth to move between two rooms that have stood too long divided. "Yes," she said softly. "I think, perhaps, it is time you both knew." They walked out together into the last of the evening light, the three of them, Beatrice leading the way down the familiar row of hives with a lantern held low against the deepening dusk, Margaret following close behind with her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill, and Tom bringing up the rear, quiet with the particular reverence of someone who senses he is about to witness something he has waited a long while to understand. The bees had settled for the night, the low hum of the row fading into stillness as it did every evening at this hour, and when they reached the end of the path, the 41st hive stood before them exactly as it always had, pale with silvered with age, its lid undisturbed beneath a light scattering of fallen leaves. Beatrice set the lantern down upon the garden wall and stood a moment before the hive, her hand resting against its lid the way it had rested there every evening for 30 years, and Margaret and Tom stood quietly behind her, neither speaking, both understanding without being told that this was not a moment to be hurried. "This was Ivy's," Beatrice said at last. "Her very first hive, given to her when she was 7 years old. Her father taught her everything on this one, patient as anything, teaching her to move slow and speak soft and never to fear the bees, only to respect them." She paused, her fingers tracing the weathered grain of the wood. "When she left for the north to nurse Clara, she meant to be home before the frost. She never was. And when the news came, Samuel could not bring himself to open this hive again. Nor could I after him. It felt, I think, like closing a door that Ivy herself had left open, and neither of us could bear to be the one who shut it." Margaret's eyes filled with quiet tears, and she reached out, hesitantly, to rest her own hand beside Beatrice's on the pale wood. "My mother never knew," she said softly, "that it stood here still untouched all these years. She would have wanted to know that Ivy was remembered so completely. Tom, standing a little apart, found his own throat tight with something he had not expected to feel for a mystery he had wondered about with nothing more than a young man's simple curiosity. "All this time," he said quietly, "I thought perhaps it was empty, or diseased. I never imagined it was kept out of love." Beatrice looked at him gently. "It has never been empty," she said. "Whatever bees have called it home these 30 years, they have done so without my help, surviving winter after winter on their own quiet resilience. The way grief itself survives, I think, whether we tend it or not." She drew a slow breath, and for the first time in 3 decades, reached for the lid itself, her hand steady now in a way it had not been steady all evening. "But I find, tonight, that I no longer wish it to stand as a door that only holds something shut. I think perhaps Ivy would rather it welcomed people in." She lifted the lid. There was no great revelation within, no hidden treasure, no forgotten letter tucked among the frames, only what 30 years of patient, undisturbed bees had built entirely on their own. Comb upon comb of pale gold wax, glowing faintly in the lantern light, thick with honey that had never once been taken, layered season upon season into something dense and rich and quietly miraculous. The bees within, disturbed only gently by the lifted lid, murmured with the low, contented hum of a healthy colony, undisturbed and thriving despite 30 years without a single hand to guide them. Beatrice looked down at what her daughter's hive had become in all the years of its silence, and felt, for the first time since that gray autumn morning when Ivy's cart had rolled away down the lane, that grief and gladness could occupy the very same breath, that a heart could ache and warm at once, and that neither feeling diminished the other. "She would have loved this," Margaret whispered, looking down at the golden comb glowing softly in the dark. "My mother always said Ivy found sweetness in everything. It seems her bees learned to do the same, even without her." Beatrice closed the lid gently, not out of the old grief now but simply to let the bees rest, and turned to the 2 people standing beside her in the darkening garden. A stranger's daughter carrying home a debt of gratitude across 30 years and 3 days' travel, and a young apprentice who had waited patiently for an answer he had never dared to ask for outright. "Come inside," she said, her voice warmer than it had been in longer than she could remember. "There is honey enough for tea, and I find I have 30 years of stories I am finally ready to tell." They returned to the cottage as the last light drained fully from the sky, and Beatrice set the kettle to boil once more while Tom laid a fresh log upon the fire, the flames catching slowly and filling the small kitchen with a warm, flickering glow that softened every corner of the room into something gentle and gold. Margaret set the small bundle of letters and the unsent note upon the mantel, beside the carved wooden box with its pattern of bees and clover, and Beatrice found, looking at the 2 collections resting side by side, that they belonged together in a way she had not expected, 2 halves of the same long-carried grief finally reunited after 30 years apart. They sat a long while at the little table, the 3 of them, sharing tea sweetened with honey drawn that very evening from Ivy's hive, the first honey taken from it in 3 decades, and it tasted, Beatrice thought, exactly the way she remembered honey tasting in the years before the frost had come early and taken everything from her, rich and warm and faintly of clover, as though the bees had kept faith with the flavor even when no one had come to ask it of them. Tom listened quietly as Beatrice spoke, for the first time in his young life, of the woman whose hive he had tended without ever fully understanding what he tended, learning at last the full shape of the small, ordinary miracle he had been part of all along without knowing it. Outside, the wind had picked up gently, rustling through the last leaves of the apple trees, and a light rain had begun to fall, tapping softly against the small-paned windows in the unhurried rhythm that Hollowmere had known for centuries. The same rain that had fallen the night Samuel first told Beatrice he loved her. The same rain that had fallen over Ivy's cradle the winter she was born. The same rain that would fall, in its own quiet time, over whatever came next for this small cottage and, its row of hives. Margaret stayed the night and several nights after, for there seemed, once the first words had finally been spoken, a great deal more that both women wished to share. Stories traded back and forth across the little table like the honey itself. Sweetness passed hand to hand, warming something in both of them that had gone too long untended. In the days that followed, Beatrice began, slowly, to include the 41st hive in her evening rounds, not harvesting from it heavily, for she found she did not wish to take too much too quickly from something that had grown so quietly resilient in its long solitude, but checking on it gently now, the way she checked on all the others, speaking to its bees the same soft words she had always spoken, welcoming them properly, at last, into the small golden family of hives that stretched the length of her garden wall. Tom took to calling it Ivy's hive openly now, without hesitation, and the village, in time, came to know the story too. Not through any grand telling but the way such things travel through small places, gently, from the baker to the vicar to the neighbors over their garden fences, until the tale of the hive they had never opened became, instead, the tale of the hive that had finally been welcomed home. Margaret returned to her own town eventually, though not before promising to write, and to visit again when the next season's honey was ready, and Beatrice found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, looking forward to letters arriving rather than dreading the silence between them. She kept the unsent note from Clara folded now inside the carved wooden box alongside Ivy's own letters, two mothers' words resting together at last. The debt Clara had carried so long finally set down gently, not through repayment but through the simple, sufficient act of being heard. And so the evenings in Hollowmere settled once more into their familiar rhythm, smoke curling from the cottage chimney, the low, contented hum of 41 hives now, not 40, drifting across the quiet garden as dusk gathered gently over the rooftops and the fire burned low behind small-paned windows fogged soft with warmth. Beatrice still walked the row each evening in the same unhurried order she always had, pausing longest, as she always had, at the hive nearest the garden wall, though her hand rested on its lid now not in grief but in quiet companionship. A small daily greeting exchanged between a mother and the sweetness her daughter had left behind, sweetness that had waited, patient as the bees themselves, 30 long years to finally be welcomed home. And if a traveler passed along the lane at dusk and saw the smoke rising soft and steady from that cottage chimney, and heard the low, contented murmur of bees settling for the night, they would think, as travelers always had, that here was a woman who had found, in the small and steady work of tending what she loved, a peace as deep and golden as the honey she kept. There was a particular afternoon each spring that Beatrice found herself returning to more often than any other, when Ivy was perhaps 10 years old and had come running into the kitchen with her pinafore full of wild violets, insisting that the bees needed flowers planted closer to the hives so they wouldn't have to fly so far for their work. Samuel had laughed gently and told her that bees would fly for miles without complaint if the honey at the end of the journey was worth it, but he had helped her plant a small bed of violets along the garden wall regardless, and the two of them had knelt there together in the soft spring soil until the light went the color of butter and Beatrice called them both in for supper. That bed of violets still grew each spring, untended now by anyone in particular, simply returning on its own the way old habits of the earth do, and Beatrice found she could not walk past it without seeing, for just a moment, a small girl with dirt under her fingernails and a fierce, tender conviction that the bees deserved an easier life. Ivy had been, from her earliest years, the sort of child who noticed things other children overlooked, the particular way frost formed patterns on the inside of the window glass, the exact moment in autumn when the swallows gathered on the telegraph wires before their long journey south, the way her mother's hands moved differently when she was worried than when she was simply tired. She had a habit, too, of naming things that other people left nameless, referring to the oldest apple tree in the orchard as Grandmother Tree, on account of its gnarled and generous branches, and calling the persistent robin that returned each spring to nest above the kitchen door Old Faithful, greeting him each morning as though he were an old friend returning from a long absence rather than simply a bird following its instincts. Samuel used to say that Ivy saw the whole world as a village full of neighbors, some with wings and some with roots and some with nothing more than wood and nails holding them together, and that she extended the same courtesy of attention to all of them equally. It was this same quality of attention that made her, by the time she reached her later teens, something of a quiet fixture in the wider life of Hollowmere, the sort of young woman people thought of first when a kindness needed doing but no one wished to make a fuss about it. It was Ivy who noticed, before anyone else in the village seemed to, that old Mrs. Pettigrew had stopped coming to market on Thursdays, and it was Ivy who walked the long way round by the widow's cottage each week afterward, ostensibly to check on a hive she kept in the old woman's back garden, but in truth simply to see that she was managing well enough alone, sitting with her for a quarter-hour over tea before continuing on her rounds. It was Ivy, too, who taught the miller's youngest daughter, a girl born with a weakness in one leg that kept her from running with the other children, to sit calmly among the hives and feel useful there in a way she could not feel useful in the games played in the village green, teaching her patiently which flowers drew the most bees and letting her hold the smoker herself once she'd proven her hands were steady enough for the task. Beatrice remembered, too, the particular ceremony of harvest days, when the whole family would set aside the better part of a week each September to bring in the season's honey, Samuel and Ivy working the frames together while Beatrice managed the extraction in the cool of the stone larder. The whole cottage filling for those days with the thick, warm scent of honey and beeswax until it seemed to seep into the very walls, lingering faintly even months later on a chill winter evening when the fire was lit and the memory of summer felt impossibly distant. Ivy had loved harvest most of all the seasons, not simply for the sweetness of the work but for the particular satisfaction of it. The sense of a whole year's quiet labor finally made visible and tangible, jars upon jars of gold lined up along the larder shelves like a record kept faithfully by the bees themselves of every flower that had bloomed in Hollowmere that year, every rain that had fallen, every long, patient day of sunlight. There had been suitors, too, in those years before she left for the north, young men from the village and beyond who had noticed Ivy's gentle capability and her easy laugh and had come calling with the particular hopeful awkwardness of young men uncertain of their welcome. She had been fond of a few of them in her own quiet way, had walked out with the miller's eldest son one whole summer before deciding, with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to everything else, that her heart simply hadn't caught the way she suspected it ought to for a marriage to follow, and had ended the courtship as gently as she had begun it, remaining friends with him afterward in the easy way of people who part without bitterness. Beatrice had wondered, sometimes, in the long years since, whether Ivy might have married eventually, might have brought her own children to toddle among the hives the way she once had herself, might have grown old in Hollowmere surrounded by a family of her own making, and she had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to let such wondering pass through her without lingering too long upon it, understanding that grief which fixes itself upon what might have been can grow crueler than grief for what simply was. The village itself had changed little in the years since, the same narrow lanes, the same church bell marking the hours, the same slow rhythm of seasons turning over the fields beyond the cottage walls, and Beatrice had found a peculiar comfort in this constancy, as though Hollowmere itself understood, in whatever way a place can be said to understand anything, that some things ought to remain steady even when the people within them are quietly rearranged by loss. The bakery still stood where it always had, though Elias's own son now helped him some mornings, learning the trade the way his father had learned it before him. The church still filled every Sunday with the same families, their numbers slowly shifting as the old passed on and the young were born, the way a hive itself renews its numbers season after season without ever quite becoming a different hive. And the row of hives behind Beatrice's cottage still stood exactly where Samuel had first set them. 40 of them opened faithfully each year, and one kept faithfully in an entirely different way. There was a quiet lull in their conversation as the light outside deepened further, and Margaret, glancing round the small kitchen with its low beams and its shelves lined with jars of amber honey, asked gently whether she might see more of the cottage, whether there were other traces of ivy still kept about the place, and Beatrice found herself rising without hesitation, glad, in a way she had not expected to be glad, for an excuse to walk through rooms she had not properly shown to anyone in years. She led Margaret first to the small room at the top of the narrow stairs that had once been Ivy's own, kept much as it always had been, the same faded quilt upon the bed, stitched by Beatrice's own mother decades before, the same small writing desk beneath the window where Ivy used to sit copying out recipes for tinctures and salves from an old family book, curious as she was about every use the hives might be put to beyond simple honey. A row of small glass jars still lined the windowsill, each one containing some pressed flower or dried herb Ivy had gathered on her rambles through the countryside beyond the village, labeled in her own careful hand, chamomile from the meadow past the mill, lavender from the garden wall, a sprig of rosemary she had once claimed, half in jest, could be planted by a doorway to keep sorrow from crossing the threshold. Margaret lingered longest over this last jar, turning it gently in her hands. "My mother kept rosemary by our door too," she said softly. "I never knew why. I always assumed it was simply for cooking." "Perhaps it was, by the time it reached her," Beatrice said. "But I imagine Ivy told her the same thing she told everyone who would listen. She had a great faith in small remedies, my daughter. She believed the world could be gentled if a person paid close enough attention and was willing to do the small quiet work of it." They returned to the kitchen as full dusk settled over the garden, and Beatrice found herself telling Margaret of the harvest days each September, the whole family working together to bring in the season's honey, and of the small ceremonies that structured Ivy's year, the blessing of the hives each autumn, the planting of violets each spring, the particular pride she took in the moment each August when the first jar of new honey was opened and tasted, always by Ivy first, as though she alone could properly judge whether the season had been a kind one. "She sounds," Margaret said slowly, turning her teacup in her hands, "like someone who understood how to be happy in small, steady ways. I think that is rarer than people credit it for being." Beatrice considered this a long moment, watching the last of the firelight play across the low beams of the ceiling. "I have thought many times over the years that grief teaches you something you did not think to learn while a person was still living," she said. "It teaches you to notice, very precisely, exactly what it was that made them who they were, because you find yourself needing to hold on to it more carefully once holding on is all that remains to you. I could not have told you, before she left for the north, exactly why my daughter hummed while she worked, or why she named the trees, or why she believed so entirely that kindness ought to be offered without ceremony. I understand these things now with a clarity I never quite possessed while she was simply, ordinarily, here." Margaret reached across the small table and rested her hand briefly over Beatrice's own, and neither woman spoke for a while after that, content to let the fire crackle low and the rain begin its soft tapping against the windowpane. Two strangers grown suddenly, quietly, into something closer to family through the simple shared work of remembering someone neither of them could any longer speak with directly, but both of whom, in their different ways, had never quite stopped listening for. There came, some weeks later, a particular evening that Beatrice would think of often afterward as the true close of that long autumn, when the first proper frost of the new season silvered the grass just as it had done 30 years before, and she walked the row of hives at dusk with a lantern in one hand exactly as she always had. Tom walked beside her that evening, for he had taken, since the night of the revelation, to joining her rounds more often than his duties strictly required, and Beatrice found she did not mind the company, understanding that some things are made lighter simply by being shared, even without words passing between two people at all. They paused together at the end of the row, before the hive that was no longer nameless, no longer silent in quite the same way it had been, and Beatrice rested her hand upon its lid as she always had, feeling beneath her palm the faint, steady warmth of the colony settling in for the long sleep of winter. "I used to think," she said, half to Tom and half to the darkening garden itself, "that keeping this hive closed was the only way I knew to keep her close. I did not understand, for the longest time, that a thing can be honored just as completely by being welcomed back into the ordinary run of days as by being sealed away from it. Tom considered this with the particular seriousness of a young man turning over an idea larger than any he had yet been asked to hold. "My grandfather used to say something like that," he offered eventually. "About grief, though he never used so many words for it. He said sorrow was like a hive in winter, that it wanted tending same as anything living, not left alone in the cold to fend entirely for itself, but not disturbed too roughly either. Just checked on, gently, now and again, so it knows it hasn't been forgotten." Beatrice smiled at this, the expression coming more easily to her now than it had in a great many autumns before. "Your grandfather sounds as though he understood bees rather better than most," she said, and Tom laughed softly, and the two of them stood a while longer in companionable silence before turning back toward the cottage, where the fire waited and the kettle would soon be singing, and where, upstairs, a letter from Margaret sat waiting to be answered, the first of what would become, over the coming years, a long and faithful correspondence between two women bound together by a debt of kindness, finally gently repaid. The winter that followed passed quietly, as winters in Hollowmere always had, snow gathering along the garden wall and softening the row of hives into low white mounds. The bees within clustered tight against the cold, waiting, as they always waited, for the first warmth of spring to call them back into motion. Beatrice spent those long evenings by the fire with Ivy's old writing desk drawn close to her chair, for she had taken, in the months since Margaret's visit, to writing down at last the small stories she had carried silently for 30 years. The violets planted along the garden wall, the tune Ivy used to hum, the rosemary believed to keep sorrow from the door, setting each one down in her own careful hand the way Ivy herself had once labeled her jars of pressed flowers, so that nothing of what she remembered might slip away unrecorded into the long quiet of the years still to come. When spring returned at last, soft and green and smelling of turned earth, Beatrice walked the row of hives on the first warm morning of the season and found the bees stirring in every one of them, the familiar low hum rising once more across the garden. 41 hives now instead of 40, indistinguishable from one another to any eye but her own, each one humming the same patient, golden song it had always hummed, each one holding, in its own quiet way, some small piece of a life that had been loved completely and was, at long last, remembered just as completely in return. News moved through Hollowmere the way water moves through soil, quietly and beneath the surface, so that by the time Reverend Aldridge came to call the following Sunday, he already knew, in the careful and half-spoken way village knowledge always traveled, that Beatrice had received a visitor connected somehow to old sorrows long left undisturbed. He said nothing of it directly when he arrived, taking his usual chair by the window with his tea prepared exactly as he always preferred it, but Beatrice found, watching him settle into the familiar rhythm of their Sunday visit, that she wanted, for the first time in 30 years, to tell him everything herself rather than let it reach him secondhand through the slow drift of village talk. She told him, then, sitting across from him as the autumn light slanted low through the window and caught the steam rising from their cups, the whole of what had happened, Margaret's arrival, the unsent letter, the debt of gratitude carried silently across 3 decades and finally set down. Reverend Aldridge listened without interrupting, in the manner he had perfected across a lifetime of listening to a village's joys and sorrows both. And when she had finished, he sat quietly a moment longer before speaking. "I remember blessing that hive," he said softly, "the autumn before your ivy left for the north. I did not know, of course, that it would be the last blessing it would receive from my hand for so many years. I have wondered, more than once over the seasons since, whether I ought to have asked you if you wished it blessed again. But it seemed, always, a question that belonged to you alone to raise, if you ever wished to raise it. I did not know myself, for the longest time, what I wished," Beatrice admitted. "I think perhaps I needed someone to arrive from outside the shape of my own grief before I could see clearly what to do with it." Reverend Aldridge nodded slowly, turning his teacup in his hands the way he always did when considering something carefully. Grief has a way of building its own walls around a person, he said. Walls meant, I think, to protect rather than imprison, though it can be difficult, from inside them, to tell which purpose they are truly serving. It does not surprise me that it took an unexpected kindness, arriving from a distance, to show you that the wall had become something other than what you first built it to be. He asked, after a moment, whether he might walk down to see the hive himself before he left, and Beatrice led him out into the low autumn light, past the row of 40 hives humming their familiar contented hum, to the one at the end that no longer stood so entirely apart from the rest. Reverend Aldridge stood before it a long while, his hands folded in the manner he used for blessings, and murmured over it the same words he had murmured over every hive in that row each autumn for as long as Beatrice could remember, words of protection and continuance, of shelter through the winter to come and safe waking in the spring beyond it. When he finished, he rested his hand briefly on the weathered lid, much as Beatrice herself did each evening, and said quietly that it seemed to him a hive blessed twice over now, once at its making and once at its welcome home, and that he could not think of a more fitting shape for a life to take, however long delayed the second blessing had been in coming. Elias the baker learned of it not from Beatrice directly but from Reverend Aldridge himself, who mentioned it gently one morning while collecting his usual loaf, and Elias, who had known Beatrice since he was a boy running errands and had wondered privately about that pale, silent hive for as many years as anyone else in the village, found himself unexpectedly moved by the news, setting aside, that same afternoon, a particularly fine loaf still warm from the oven and carrying it himself down the lane to Beatrice's cottage rather than waiting for her usual morning collection. He said little when she opened the door, only that he had heard, and that he was glad, in the plain and unadorned way villagers offered their gladness to one another, before pressing the loaf into her hands and turning to go. Beatrice stood a moment in her doorway watching him walk back up the lane, the loaf warm against her palms exactly as it had been each morning for 30 years, and found herself thinking of a summer decades before, long before Ivy had ever left for the north, when a much younger Elias had come running to the cottage in a state of considerable distress, cradling in his cupped hands an injured swallow he had found fallen from its nest beneath the bakery eaves. It had been Ivy, then no more than 12 years old herself, who had taken the bird gently from him and fashioned a nest of soft cloth in a basket by the kitchen fire, feeding it patiently with a dropper of sugared water and crushed insects for the better part of a fortnight, refusing to let anyone in the household so much as raise their voice near the basket for fear of frightening the creature further. Beatrice remembered the particular tenderness with which Ivy had tended that bird, checking on it at all hours, murmuring to it in the same soft, unhurried voice she used with the bees, and the day it finally tested its wings and flew, unsteadily but successfully, from the garden wall out toward the hedgerows beyond. Ivy had stood watching it go with an expression Beatrice had never quite forgotten. Joy and sorrow mingled so completely that it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. She had cried, that evening, not from any grief at the bird's leaving but from something harder to name, a recognition, perhaps, even at 12 years old, that love and letting go were never truly separate acts but two halves of the very same gesture, and that the finest thing a person could do for something they loved was sometimes simply to have tended it well enough that it no longer needed tending. Elias, grown now into a broad and steady man with a bakery of his own and a son learning the trade beside him, had never forgotten that summer either, and it was this memory, more than any other, that had sent him down the lane with a warm loaf on the afternoon he learned the hive had finally been opened, for he understood, in his own plain way, that some kindnesses simply asked to be answered when the moment for answering finally arrived, whether 30 years had passed or 30 days. The village, in the weeks that followed, seemed to settle into a quiet collective understanding of what had happened, an understanding that required no grand announcement or explanation, simply the gradual, gentle recognition that something long closed had been opened, and that the woman who had carried it closed for so many years deserved neither pity nor intrusion but simply the same steady presence her neighbors had always offered her. A nod at market, a shared word over the garden wall. The small unspoken courtesies of a place that had watched her grief from a respectful distance for 3 decades and now watched, with equal quiet respect, as she set some portion of it down. Autumn deepened further into the true heart of the season during those weeks, the apple trees in Beatrice's orchard dropping their last fruit into the damp grass below, the evenings drawing in earlier each day until the lamps were lit before the row of hives had even finished their final restless murmur before winter sleep. Beatrice found herself walking those evening rounds with a fuller heart than she had carried in longer than she could measure, the cold air sharp and clean in her lungs, the particular scent of autumn, wood smoke and damp earth, and the last sweetness of fallen fruit, settling over the garden like a blessing of its own kind. She had always loved this season best, she realized, walking the row in the fading light, precisely because it asked nothing of pretense, precisely because it allowed a person to feel the year closing honestly around them. Grief and gladness both permitted their proper season, neither rushed nor denied. Tom's grandfather, whom Tom had quoted that evening beside the hive, came himself some weeks later to see Beatrice, an old man now well into his 80s who had known Samuel in their younger years and had kept his own small apiary until his hands grew too unsteady for the work. He sat with Beatrice a long while by the fire, sharing memories of Samuel from years before Beatrice herself had known him. A young man even then patient and unhurried, already showing the particular gift for coaxing life from stubborn colonies that would define the whole of his working life. It was, Tom's grandfather said, a rare thing to watch a person's whole character reveal itself so clearly in something as simple as how they kept bees, patient men making patient beekeepers, and he had always thought Samuel among the finest he had known, not for any particular skill of technique but for the plain, steady kindness with which he approached every hive, every season, every small living thing entrusted, however briefly, to his care. "Your ivy had it too," the old man said. "That same steadiness. I remember watching her as a girl, no older than my own grandson is now, and thinking there goes a beekeeper who will never need to be taught patience. For she was simply born already possessing it, the way some people are born already knowing how to listen properly, without needing the skill drilled into them by years of practice." He paused, looking into the fire a long moment. "I am glad, truly glad, that her hive stands open again. It seemed to me, walking past your garden wall these many years, that something in the row was holding its breath, waiting for permission to exhale fully. I think perhaps we have all been waiting alongside you, in our own quiet way, without quite knowing it." Beatrice found these words settling into her slowly over the days that followed, the image of a whole village holding its breath alongside her without her ever fully realizing the shared nature of that long, patient waiting, and she understood, more clearly than she had before, that grief carried in a small place is never entirely solitary, however solitary it may feel to the one carrying it, for a village remembers together even when it does not speak its remembering aloud, tending its shared sorrows the way it tends its shared hedgerows and lanes and ancient, leaning church walls, with a steadiness that asks for no acknowledgement and offers none of its own, simply persisting faithfully until the person at the center of the sorrow finds their own way toward whatever peace awaits them. The first true snow of that winter came on a night when Beatrice sat late by the fire, later than her usual hour, unable quite to bring herself to bank the coals and climb the stairs to bed, content instead to watch the flames settle slowly into embers while the wind pressed soft and steady against the shuttered windows. She had grown, in the weeks since Margaret's visit, into the habit of sitting this way some evenings, not from any sleeplessness or unease but simply because the quiet of those late hours had come to feel like its own kind of company, a stillness she no longer needed to fill with anything beyond the crackle of the fire and the low murmur of her own unhurried thoughts. She thought, that night, of all the winters that had passed over that cottage and its row of hives, the ones she had spent young and hopeful beside Samuel, learning together the patient rhythms of the apiary, and the ones she had spent older, quieter, tending the hives alone through the long gray months while the one at the end of the row stood untouched beneath its blanket of snow. She thought of Ivy as a small girl, cheeks flushed pink with cold, stamping snow from her boots at the kitchen door and declaring, with the fierce conviction of the very young, that the bees must be dreaming beneath their snow-covered hives, dreaming of the summer flowers they would return to once the frost had lifted. Beatrice had never quite been able to say, in all the years since, whether she believed this herself, whether bees dreamed at all in their long winter cluster, but she found she liked the thought of it regardless, liked imagining some small golden dream persisting quietly beneath the snow through even the coldest, darkest nights of the year. The snow fell steadily through that night and into the following morning, softening the whole of Hollowmere beneath a deep and even white, silencing the lanes, hushing the church bell to something muffled and distant, transforming the row of hives behind Beatrice's cottage into a line of low white mounds indistinguishable from one another beneath their fresh covering. Beatrice rose early despite the cold, wrapped herself in her warmest shawl, and walked the row as she always did, though there was little enough to tend in such deep winter beyond simply confirming, hive by hive, that the snow had not settled too heavily upon any single roof, brushing each one gently clear with a soft bristled broom kept for exactly this purpose. She paused longest, as she always did, before the hive at the end of the row, and found herself smiling faintly at the sight of it, indistinguishable now beneath its blanket of snow from any of the 40 hives beside it, no longer marked apart by pale, unweathered wood or by the particular stillness of long neglect, simply one hive among many, sleeping the same patient winter sleep as all the rest, waiting for the same spring to call it back into its golden, humming life. She brushed the snow from its roof with the same unhurried care she gave to every other hive along the row, and found, in the small ordinary sameness of the gesture, a peace she had not expected grief to ever fully allow her, the peace of a thing finally, fully returned to the gentle, unremarkable rhythm of an ordinary life, loved no less for being ordinary, remembered no less for requiring, at last, no separate remembering at all. That evening, as the fire burned low and the snow continued its soft, steady fall beyond the shuttered windows, Beatrice took down the carved wooden box from the mantel, the one with its pattern of bees and clover worn smooth by handling, and opened it, as she did now most evenings, to read again some small portion of the letters kept inside, Ivy's own careful hand alongside Clara's, 2 voices from 30 years past resting together in the quiet lamplight. She read slowly, unhurried, the way she did everything now in the long, peaceful evenings of that winter, and when she had finished, she closed the box gently, banked the fire for the night, and climbed the narrow stairs to bed, falling asleep, as she did most nights now, to the faint, familiar sound of snow settling soft against the window panes, and beneath it, fainter still, the low and patient hum of 41 hives sleeping quietly together in the dark, dreaming, perhaps, of the golden summer waiting for them all on the other side of winter. There was a particular morning in early spring, not long after the snow had finally retreated from the garden wall, when Margaret returned to Hollowmere for the first time since her original visit, arriving this time not as a stranger uncertain of her welcome, but as someone Beatrice had come to watch for with the same quiet anticipation she once reserved for Ivy's letters. She came on the same afternoon coach, carrying with her a small jar of preserves made from her own garden, a token exchanged now between the 2 women in the easy manner of people who have settled comfortably into friendship, and she found Beatrice in the garden as before, though this time kneeling not among withering lavender but among the first green shoots of the new season, coaxing the soil gently around a bed of violets just beginning to show their color. "You've the same violets, then?" Margaret said, settling onto the bench beside the garden wall, watching Beatrice work with the patient care of someone entirely at home in her own small corner of the world. "I remember you mentioning them, that Ivy planted them herself as a girl." "The very same bed," Beatrice said, sitting back on her heels to survey the tender new growth. "They return each spring without any real tending from me, as though they've simply decided on their own that this corner of the garden belongs to them permanently. I've come to think of them as rather like the bees in that regard. Some things, once properly planted, simply carry on without needing to be asked." They walked the row together that afternoon, the 41 hives all stirring now with the particular restless energy of early spring. Bees venturing out in increasing numbers to test the season's first flowers, and Margaret paused, as she always did on her visits, before the hive at the end, resting her hand briefly against its wood in a gesture that had become, over the months of her visits, something of a small ritual between the two women, a shared acknowledgement of all that Hive had come to hold and all it had finally been permitted to release. "I think my mother would be glad," Margaret said quietly, watching the bees move in and out of the hive's small entrance. "To know it ended here, in a garden like this one, with violets planted by a girl who loved bees enough to worry after their comfort, and hives tended faithfully enough that even 30 years of silence couldn't undo the good in them." Beatrice considered this, watching the low spring light catch the new grass along the garden wall, gilding it faintly gold, the same soft gold that seemed, on such afternoons, to touch everything in Hollowmere at once: the hives, the violets, the old stone cottage with its curling chimney smoke, the whole small, patient, ordinary world that had held her grief so gently for so long and had, in its own unhurried way, finally helped her set it down. "I think," she said, "that endings are rarely as separate from beginnings as we imagine them to be. This garden has ended a great many things over the years, and begun just as many. I've stopped trying to tell most days which is which. I simply tend what's here, and trust that whatever needs remembering will find its own quiet way of staying." The two women sat together a while longer in the mild spring sun, saying little else, content to watch the bees move steadily between the hives and the first hesitant blooms of the season. And when evening came, they walked back to the cottage together, unhurried, the whole of Hollowmere settling gently into dusk around them, smoke rising soft from the chimney, the low golden hum of 41 hives drifting quiet and constant across the darkening garden. Patient as it had always been patient, as it would go on being long after any single story told about it had finally, gently, come to rest. There is a particular quality to the light in Hollowmere on a summer evening, when the long row of hives hums low and golden behind a cottage that has stood for generations at the edge of the village. A light that seems to slow time itself, drawing out the last hour before dusk until it feels less like an ending to the day and more like a long, unhurried breath held gently between one season and the next. Beatrice had come to notice this light more closely in the years since Margaret's first visit, pausing more often than she once did simply to watch it settle over the garden wall, gilding the violets, catching the last bees returning heavy-legged to their hives, warming the pale wood of the row until every hive, indistinguishable now from any other, seemed to glow faintly from within, as though holding some small ember of the day's warmth against the cooler hours to come. She had grown, too, into the quiet habit of telling Ivy's story to those who asked, gently and without hurry, understanding at last that a story kept too closely guarded can, over enough years, come to feel like a burden rather than a gift, while a story shared freely, offered the way honey is offered, in small sweet portions to whoever has need of it, only grows richer for the sharing. Visitors to Hollowmere sometimes heard it now, from Elias at the bakery or from Reverend Aldridge after Sunday service. The tale of the hive that stood silent for 30 years and was finally, gently, welcomed home, and those who heard it found themselves looking differently, afterward, at the small ordinary things they themselves had left unopened in their own lives, the letters unwritten, the doors left closed, the griefs kept sealed away out of a love too tender to disturb. And so the story of Hollowmere's 41 hives became, in its own quiet way, a small gift passed from one person to the next, much like honey itself, sweetness drawn patiently from difficult seasons and offered freely to whoever might need a little of its warmth. And Beatrice, walking her row each evening in the golden hush of dusk, understood at last that this was perhaps the truest purpose any garden could serve, not simply to hold what has been lost, but to keep it gently, faithfully alive, until it is ready in its own good time to be shared. There are places in this world that seem to hold their stories gently, the way a cupped hand holds water, careful not to spill what has been trusted to it, and Hollowmere had always been, for Beatrice, exactly such a place. She had come to notice, in the years since Margaret's first visit, how the village itself seemed to soften around old griefs rather than rushing past them. How a place built slowly over centuries learns, in its own quiet way, the same patience it takes to keep a hive well, understanding that some things cannot be hurried toward health, only tended faithfully until they find it on their own. She thought often, in the unhurried evenings of her later years, of how strange and how simple it was that a single hive, left silent for 3 decades, should have taught her more about grief and about love than any book or sermon ever had. It had taught her that some doors are closed not to keep sorrow out but to keep love safe within them, and that such doors, when finally opened, do not release the sorrow they held so much as reveal how much sweetness had been quietly growing there all along, patient and golden, waiting only for someone brave enough, or perhaps simply tired enough, to lift the lid and let it breathe. Tom would go on, in the years that followed, to keep hives of his own a short walk down the lane, and he would tell his own children someday, when they were old enough to understand it, the story of the hive that stood silent so long behind old Mrs. Thorne's cottage, of the woman who had traveled 3 days to bring a debt of kindness home, and of an evening when a lantern held low against the dusk had shown him that grief, tended patiently enough, could soften into something closer to companionship than sorrow. He would tell them, too, the smaller truth beneath the larger one, that bees need very little from us to keep their quiet work going, only enough care that they are not entirely forgotten, and that people, he had come to believe, are not so very different in this regard. Beatrice herself lived on in that cottage many years more, walking her row of 41 hives each evening in the same unhurried order she always had, pausing, as she always did, a moment longer at the one nearest the garden wall, her hand resting against its lid not out of grief now but out of the simple, steady habit of love that asks for nothing beyond its own quiet continuing. And on the evenings when the light lay long in gold across the garden, and the smoke curled soft from her chimney, and the low patient hum of the hives drifted out across Hollowmere into the gathering dusk, she would sometimes catch herself humming too softly, without quite meaning to, a small wandering tune she had not made up herself but had carried, gently, all these years, on behalf of someone who once hummed it first among the very same flowers, the very same bees, the very same patient. Golden light, thank you for listening tonight. Rest well and sleep peacefully.